Hello, welcome to the second video in this Advent.js video blog series. In this video, we're going to look at taking our simple caching example and moving some of that caching logic and fetching logic into their own custom hooks. So custom hooks in React allow us to kind of abstract away some of that complex logic and put it in like a little module or a package that we can then use across the rest of our application or any other application. We can use it in any component. So just to show you where we're up to from the previous example, if you haven't watched the previous video or read the previous blog, I suggest you go back and check that out. You can get to all of this content by going to monoglot.dev, and you'll see here we have our simple caching with local storage example. I also suggest you go and grab the code if you don't have this yet. So where we got up to in the previous video is now pushed up to GitHub. So if you go to github.com/monoglot/simple caching, that will be the previous example. And then if you clone this down and change into the directory, we should be pretty much ready to go. So to show you where we got up to in the last example, this is our application here on the left. And this is VS Code, obviously, on the right. We have a skaters component, which you're seeing here. If I have a look at skaters, it's a little bit messy now. See, it's kind of filled up with a lot of logic. It's not just kind of taking a collection of things and rendering it to the screen. It's no longer just responsible for that. It's also responsible for all of the fetching logic. But if we have a look at what it's actually returning here, we're looking at the length of the skaters. If we have some skaters, we're mapping over all of them and rendering out a name and a stance, which is what you're seeing here. And then when we actually mount the component, it's going off and either fetching that data from our local storage cached version of that, or we're making a request for a fresh version of that data, and then rendering it to the screen. So you'll see here on the left, if I refresh, you'll see this loading state. So that's because we don't currently have that data in the cache. And you'll see here on the left, it actually says using API skaters because it's gone off to get those API skaters before rendering them. But now if I refresh, you'll see that it basically doesn't even show the loading state, or we see it flash there for a second. But yeah, and you'll see down the bottom here, we're seeing use cached skaters. So this is falling into this part here where we already have them in our cache. So we're just setting them based off what we had in local storage. And that's that console log that you're seeing there. Cool. But as I said, this is getting a little bit confusing, a little bit complicated. There's a lot of kind of fetching and other logic that's not really relevant to our skaters here. So why don't we just bite off a small piece first and abstract out this local storage stuff. So let's create a new folder called hooks and a new file called use cache. Actually, we'll call it use local storage. If we keep this as generic as possible, then we can reuse it across all of our projects. If we make it use cache, then we can kind of only use it for that cache example. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to pull out this json.parse local storage get item part, and we're going to build our own function. So let's say, yeah, let's just call it get. So get is equal to, is going to be equal to a function, which is going to return us json.parse local storage.getItem URL. And you see we're passing in a URL here. So we're probably going to need to pass that into our function. Cool. So const get is equal to passing in that URL and getting back whatever is in local storage. And you'll see here, if that json.parse fails, then we're just going to fall back to the value null. Cool. So now let's make a set version of that. So const set is equal to, and if we have a look at our skaters, for this one, we're going to need the URL and then the data. So I'll copy this statement back in here. We're going to take in our URL and our data. And then in our function, we're going to call local storage.setItem for that URL with the JSON stringified version of that data. Cool, so we've got our get and we've got our set. Now we need to actually write our custom hook. So a hook looks very similar to a functional component. So use local storage equals a functional component, and inside that we have a return that returns some stuff, and we say export default use local storage. So there are only a couple of differences here that you might notice. First one is that it's a lowercase u. So anytime we create a component, it needs to be prepended with the word use in lowercase, and then whatever the name of our actual hook is. So this is use local storage. And you'll see that's lowercase, which makes it a little bit different to a component, which would always be a capital by convention. Okay, cool. So we have our use local storage, and then we're exporting the default of use local storage. Now we just need to work out what we actually want to return from our component. So when we call use local storage, so if I was consuming this this hook somewhere else, if I was to say const, I want to get out the get function, and I want to call use local storage. So this is how we would consume it within another component. So we call use local storage, and then we'll get back whatever this object is. And we wanted to pull out get so that we could then say somewhere else in our component, I want to get a particular URL. And then we would say const, skaters equals, and if this was our HTTPS, blah, 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 for Tony Hawk's Pro Skater API. Cool. So this is how we would consume it. So we want to expose this get function. So here we've declared this get function, and then we want to return it from this hook. So we can say, I want to return get, which is kind of like saying get is equal to get. But because we're using ES6, we can just say get. So because the identifier is the same, I can just say get. If this was like get from cache, but I wanted to expose it as just get, then here I could say get is equal to get from cache. But because they're going to be the same value, the same identifier, I can just say I want to expose get. And then likewise, I want to expose set. So now we're returning an object from our use local storage hook, and then somewhere else in our application, we can consume it like this. So I'm just going to get rid of this bit now. Also, this get and set could totally be inside here if we felt like that was a little bit cleaner. Actually, yeah, I might leave them inside, but because they're not accessing any variables that are only in scope inside this hook, because it's just using JSON.parse, which is available globally, and local storage, which is available globally, we could actually put them outside of the component. But just to keep everything bundled together, let's just have it on the inside. Okay, so now we have our use local storage. So now how about we try to refactor our skaters component to use that instead of these confusing statements here. So the first thing we're going to have to do is we're going to have to use our hook. So I'm going to say import use local storage from, and then that's going to be inside our hooks directory and our use local storage file. Cool. So now we've imported this. If I was to try to use this in this function here, so this get skaters function isn't actually a React component, right? This skaters component is the React component, but inside there, we're calling a function called get skaters. So you might just think, well, I can just use my hook here. So I could say const, might just declare this under the URL so we can use it, const skaters equals use local storage. Oh, sorry, this will get us back our get. And then we could say const skaters equals get our URL. So you might think this would work if we try to save it. Well, yeah, we're going to, we get this error saying React hook use local storage is called in function get skaters, which is neither a React functional component or a custom React hook. So this is telling us that we can't actually use a custom hook or any hook inside a function. It always needs to be either used inside another hook or a React component. So if we want to use our local storage hook, we're going to have to move it down to our skaters component. So here where we're using use state, this is where we would want to call use local storage to get our function. Now our function could be used in another function or anywhere in our application. Our function doesn't need to be inside a React component or another React hook. Just this use local storage call here. So the first time you call that hook, that needs to only be within a React component or within another React hook. Cool. So, but what I could do is here where I'm calling get skaters, I'm passing it our set skaters. I could also pass it our get. And then here we could say we want to bring in that get. And then our cached skaters could be equal to get URL. And then that should be exactly the same as this line. So if we comment out this line and resave, we should actually see these loading from the cache. Whoa. And we know that they loaded from the cache because we saw them straight away. So every time we refresh, we're seeing that. Cool. So that's a successful refactor. We've been able to refactor our code so that we can move this confusing logic that takes a lot of understanding about how we're actually dealing with caching and moving it out into this nice little get function. So I can get rid of this now. The next thing I'm going to do is refactor this statement so that we don't need to use local storage anywhere in our component. We can just rely on those hooks. So to do this, I'm going to need to pull out the set method or function. And then again, I'm going to have to pass that up to our get skaters. Okay. And then rather than saying local storage.setItem blah, I could just say set the URL to be that data. And I don't need to worry about stringifying it here. Again, that takes some knowledge about how we're actually storing that information. We don't want this component to need to worry about that knowledge. We just want to be able to say, here, for this URL, set this data. So we can get rid of this statement. And if we go and clear our cache, so we're going to have to go to storage. This will be in a slightly different location in Google Chrome or Safari or something else if you're using that. But I'm just going to delete this and refresh. And you see we get that loading state. Now it should successfully write that to the cache, which we see here. So I've got my skaters back here, which is really good. So now, again, we have refactored this to use our get from use local storage. And we've refactored this to use our set from use local storage. Cool. So we're using our custom hook. And this looks a little bit cleaner, but not very clean. So now that we understand how simple hooks are to use, how about we look at abstracting out our actual requesting logic to its own hook? So again, we're going to create a use request hook. Now, because I've called this use request and not like use skaters, I'm trying to keep it as generic as possible so that we could reuse it anywhere. So here I'm going to say const use request is equal to this arrow function. And then again, we're going to export out the default as use request. But here I'm going to want to be able to use this with any URL. So fetching any resources. So I'm going to accept a URL as a parameter. And then I need to work out what I'm going to return here. So again, I'm going to return an object of things. You don't have to return an object. You can return a singular value. But for this use request hook, we're gonna add some additional functionality that we're going to need to return an object because there'll be a few things that we can do with this use request hook. Cool. So the very first thing we want to do here is we probably want to move. Actually, let's keep it nice and simple. How about we just comment out get skaters from our use effect, which means we can just comment out our full use effect. We can comment out our const skaters equals set skaters, and let's say const. Let's keep it nice and simple and just say const data equals use request. And then we're going to need a URL for that. So let's copy URL from get skaters and put that down here and pass it through to our use request. And let's just comment out our return as well. Sorry, this looks a little bit messy for now, but we will clean this up. So we're just going to return here temp working and save. We might also console log out our data. So console.log data so we can see what's in it. You'll see here on the left where we're getting a nice big error. Don't worry about that just yet. We will fix that up. Let's const data equals use request. So if we have a look, we've pulled in use request from /hooks/use request. If we go into use request, we haven't actually saved the file. So it's complaining that we don't actually get anything back. Cool. So then temp working is working. And if we have a look in our console, you'll see that we're getting back undefined. So if I have a look at what we're actually doing here, we're pulling out data from our use request. But if we have a look at use request, just close this one down. If we have a look at use request, we're actually just returning an empty object. So data, or no matter what we try to destructure off this, this value that's coming back, it's always going to be undefined because we're not actually returning anything. So why don't we try returning something? Why don't we copy our Axios call here across to use request? Because we're using await, we're going to have to make this an async functional component. So we await axios.get URL, and then we want to pass that data back in our hook. And it's telling us that it doesn't know what Axios is because we haven't actually imported it. So let's import Axios from Axios. And now we see temp working. We're still getting undefined. So let's refresh. Yeah, so this is happening straight away. We're returning data. And then it's not actually updating with the fresh data that we're getting back from our axios.get. So this works in a similar way to a React component. So here, because we want to wait for this data to come back and then we want to set its value, we probably need to use state and use effect to kind of remember that data. So let's import use state. We need to destructure use state and use effect from React. And here we're going to say const let's just call it data and set data. Actually, we can't call it data because we need to use data. We need to destructure that from our Axios call. So maybe I will actually call it data and set data and say equals use state. And then here, when we get back data inside our destructuring statement here, we can actually rename it directly. So we could call this response data. So this is the response from our request to Axios. Okay, so another thing that I wanted to mention here is that we're using use state, but we're not passing it any value to initialize that value. So this is going to be set to undefined the first time this request is made. And we can confirm that by saving this. This will refresh and we will see undefined. So this value is always undefined because we're never calling set data to change its value. So let's use effect. And in that use effect, we're going to call get data. Whoa, we did not mean to do that. Okay, get data. And then we're going to declare get data as a functional async arrow function. And then we are going to place this statement in there, which means we can also get rid of this async around our use request. So now we call use request, we pass in a URL. It declares our data variable. And then it will return that straight away, so we'll get undefined. But then it's also going to call get data as soon as our component mounts. And then get data is an async function, which is going to call axios.get for that URL. And then when we get the data back, it's going to immediately rename it to response data. So then here maybe we will console log out our response data to see what's actually in there. Okay, so you'll see here that when we refreshed our component, we got this undefined, which is inside our skaters component. So that's what data, oops, sorry, ignore all that stuff at the top. That's what this data value is. When we console log out data, we see undefined. But then the next thing that we see printed out here is an array of 13 items, and that's inside our use request. So inside use request, when we're printing out response data, this is what we're getting back from the server. So now we could set data to be our new response data that comes back and get rid of this console log. And now we should see it print out undefined the first time. And then when we get that value back, we see this array of 13 values. So the cool thing about hooks is that when we declare these stateful variables, they're like live variables. So anytime we call set data, anything that's consuming our hook, so you'll see here we're consuming use request. So when we get back this data, that's not just what the data value was the first time we called it, but anytime set data is called within this use request hook, it's going to propagate those changes down to anything that's consuming it. So by using this use request hook, we can kind of subscribe to any changes that happen on data. So you'll see here that we've only called const data equals use request. We haven't got a use effect or anything happening here. We're just grabbing that data once, but then when that gets set to a new version of the data that came back from the server, this component is automatically re-rendering, and you can see here that we're printing out that array. So we could uncomment our return skaters.length statement, which is going to actually render our skaters, and we can get rid of this temporary return. We are getting skaters is not defined. Oh yes, because it's not called skaters now, it's called data. So maybe we want to use our trick that we saw before, where we're getting data back, but we want to immediately rename it to skaters. And now it's saying data is not defined because we're trying to console log that out. So let's just console log out skaters so we can see what's going on. And you'll see here we get this cannot access property length. Skaters is undefined. So if we scroll up a little bit, we'll see that we're printing out undefined the first time. So when we hit this skaters.length, .length only exists on an array or an array-like structure. So if data is equal to undefined, then if we try to call skaters.length, it's going to fail. So what can we do to fix this? Well, as I said, we're going to make our use request a little bit smarter. So rather than just returning the data that we get back when it's available, we also want to return a loading state. And we can declare that loading state as being equal to, I guess, not data. So if we don't have data yet, then we could consider ourselves, we could assume that we're still loading. So the first time we run this use request, we declare data, and remember that's equal to undefined. So at that point, when we say const loading is equal not data, this is going to inverse a falsy value to true, or a truthy value to false. So in this case, data would be undefined, which is a falsy value. And so we say not data, which is equal to true. So now loading is equal to true. When it eventually does get the data and it resets this set data to the new response data, this hook will re-render, which means that it'll run this statement again. And at that point, data will be equal to an array of skaters. So that's a truthy value, an array with values in it. So then we're saying we want a not truthy value, which is going to be equal to false. So this loading state will essentially let us determine from outside of this hook, is our user request hook still loading, or do we actually have that data back? So if we save that and go back to our skaters, we can destructure off that loading state when we call use request. We could then say, if we're loading, we want to immediately return a paragraph tag that says loading. So now, if loading is set to true, we're immediately going to return, which means we're never going to hit this statement. If loading is set to false, so once we get those values back from the server, it's then going to fall back to this statement, which is going to return our actual rendered skaters. So now if we save that, cool, we get our loading state, and then we get our skaters. Awesome. So then if we refresh our page again, we get our loading state, and we get our skaters. So you see, the request part is working, but we don't have any of that smart caching stuff going on anymore, because that's all still sitting inside our skaters component. So how about we clean up some of our skaters component so we don't have all of this unnecessary stuff happening. We could also move our URL outside of our skaters just to keep that a little bit cleaner. So now inside our skaters component, we call use local storage. We get back get and set. We then call our use request hook and pass through that URL. And then we either get back our skaters or our loading state. Or sorry, we get back both. But if we're loading, we return a paragraph saying that we're loading. And if we have the skaters, then we want to render them. So this is basically all we need for our component. We don't actually need any of this get skaters logic. So let's just think about what we need here. So we're already doing this statement. We probably need to pull in our get and set from use local storage. So how about just so we can focus on one file, let's cut this from this file and move it across to use request. We're going to comment it out because we will refactor it. And then inside our skaters component, you'll see here that it's telling us that use state and use effect are no longer used. It's telling us that Axios is no longer used. And here we're not actually using get or set, so we can get rid of this call to use local storage, which will then tell us that this import of use local storage is no longer required. So you see this is much cleaner, right? This is now just our skaters component. It calls use request, which is responsible for all that other stuff. And then if we're loading, we return a loading state. Otherwise, we return our actual skaters. We can also, we are actually doing some of that logic here. So we can get rid of whether we are in that loading state, because we don't need to check if skaters.length is greater than 0, because at this point, we're going to have a populated array. So we can actually get rid of all of this and just return skaters.map render skater. So now, even if we get back an empty array, it's just going to skip this step. But if we have an array of skaters, it's going to map over each of those skaters and render a skater for us. So now this logic is super, super clean. This component is only responsible for that one thing, which is actually rendering our skaters. And you'll see even after removing all of that stuff, if we refresh, we see the loading state. We might want to put a capital L on that just to make it look a little bit more professional. But we see our loading state and then we see our skaters. So now all we need to do is implement our actual caching logic inside use request. Okay, so we already have this get data, which is going off and actually fetching the data. So really all we need to do is add in our const cached skaters logic. So we can say const cached, I guess we wouldn't want cached skaters, we would probably want cached data is equal to get URL. So we need to bring in use local storage. Sorry, this is from /use local storage. We then need to actually call that hook in our inside our use request hook. So we get back get and set is equal to use local storage. And now we can say const cached data is equal to get URL. So that's going to get us that cached data. And then we can say if we actually have cached data, then we want to set data to be our cached data. Cool, so this is a little bit of a shorthand. I'm not sure if I went through this in the last video, but this is basically saying if cached data is a truthy value, then we want to set the data to be whatever. we can actually short circuit that by saying cache data. So if this is a truthy value, then it will evaluate what's on the right of here and actually run that function. If this is a falsy value, then it will just ignore whatever's on the right. This will just be undefined and it will move on. So we want to say const cache data is equal to go and get from the cache, from that URL, our data if we have it. If we do have it, then set the data to that cache data straight away, and then go and make this request. And then when we get back the fresh data, we would want to write it to the cache. So here we could say, well, we could use the same sort of pattern and say response data and set. Yes, sorry, set response data. Cool. So these are kind of our two paths that we had up here. So here we had if cached skaters, then set the skaters, which is what we're doing here. So if cached data, we want to set the data, which is this this live variable that our skaters component has subscribed to that. And then we want to make a request off to the fresh data. We want to get that fresh data back and then set it in the cache. So we want to overwrite the cache with that new fresh data. And then again, set data is going to re-render our component. So our skaters component that is subscribed to that is going to re-render. So now if we save this, we can also get rid of all of this stuff, keep it nice and clean. And then you'll see here, if we refresh on the side, we're back to that awesome, super quick cache loading. So we see that loading flash for a second, and we could fix that if we decided that was a bad user experience to actually see that flash. But for now, we're just going to keep it simple for this example. But every time I refresh, it just flashes with that loading, and then we see our skaters straight away. And if I was to go to our storage and remove that item and then refresh, you see we get that loading state. We see our skaters. And then every time that we refresh, oh, we've got a problem here. So we're seeing object, 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 object. Okay, so, and the value is set to undefined. So something has gone horribly wrong here. And that's because our set, I'm passing it our response data as the first parameter. But if you have a look at our use local storage set, we need the URL to be passed and then the data, and it will go and set that to our local storage. So here I just need to pass through our URL and our response data. And if I save that, we should get our loading, and then it comes back. If I refresh, yeah, and as I refresh, you'll see that it's using that cached version. It's kept the old version of the local storage, so I could delete that and delete our, sorry, I'll just delete all from our local storage. And now when I refresh, I see loading, and then we get those skaters. And when I refresh, we get that cached version straight away. So that's working as we expected. Cool. So just a quick summary. We took all of that complicated logic that we had within our skaters component that was responsible for fetching, caching, all of that information. We've moved that out into separate modules or separate hooks. And then all our skaters component is responsible for is calling that hook. So saying, give me that data when you're ready. If you're still loading, this is what I want to look like. And if you're not still loading, this is what I want to look like. So that's all the responsibility of the skaters component. It's just asking for the data, rendering those two different states depending on whether it has the data back or not. And then we've moved that use request logic into its own hook, which takes in a URL, makes that request for the data, and also exposes that loading state. So this now has three responsibilities. It tells any subscribing components whether it's still loading the data or not. It also provides the data, and it deals with all of that caching stuff. We've then also broken that down even further to move the actual local storage interface out into its own hook as well. So use local storage is just these two clean functions for get and set, which either just get data for a URL or set data for that particular URL. So that allows us to, again, just move that into a module and then not need to think about it anymore. We can just consume that hook anywhere in our application, in any component or other hook, and really like clean up our logic so it's much easier to read. Cool. So that's everything I wanted to go through in this video. Please feel free to subscribe, like, do all the YouTube things. Also, if you want to come subscribe, or I don't know what you do on GitHub, like things, fork things, star things. That's what you do. GitHub stars are awesome. If you want to come and star some things on the Monoglog page so I can see that people are actually reading it or watching these videos, and also go and check out the monoglog.dev blog. So this will have a blog article that goes through all of this stuff that I just went through in this video, as well as a video to go through a video version. Cool. Thanks for watching. See ya.